Okay. So we're going to talk about a couple of like specific study strategies today. Um, the two main ones are using spaced repetition and self-quizzing, and we're going to talk about them in relation to what we normally do when we study. Um, so first we'll talk about the differences between spaced repetition technique and cramming. Um, has anyone stayed up all night studying for a test before in your lives? I'm assuming most people have. And if you have, um, did you think it did it increase your confidence that you're going to do well on the test? And did you do well on the test? Those are the things you want to ask yourself if you stayed up cramming. And the final thing is, do you remember any of that stuff that you stayed up studying for all night today, months or year or so after you did that stay up all night studying? The answers to most of those are probably first one, you know, cramming does work. Staying up all night will get you through that test the next day, as long as you don't fall asleep while you're taking the test, and as long as you were in a reasonably prepared space before you started cramming. You're not going to learn half a semester of work in one night. That is just not a doable thing. But if you've kept up somewhat, then that technique might work. What's going to suffer is your long-term retention. When you do things over a short period of time, you do remember it, but you remember it for a lot shorter than you do if you do use some of these other techniques. Because what happens is with your memories, when we talked about this last week a little bit, when you're building those neural connections between the memory, the knowledge of that subject, and your processing center, when you can actually do reason and work with that bit of knowledge to do something meaningful with, you create neural pathways when you study. When you cram, it creates those neural pathways. It doesn't create very strong ones because you're going through it really quickly, but it does create them. So you can recall that information relatively soon after that technique, like the next morning or the next afternoon when you have the test. But what happens is those connections aren't very strong, so they tend to fade and disappear relatively quickly. Has any of you ever used something resembling a spaced repetition study technique where you break up your studying into little bits and pieces and do it over time, or revisit the material over time? Show of hands of anyone who has done that before. Robert has. Excellent. Robin, Katie, or the Davis family, is that something you guys have ever done? Yep, you guys have done that. And that's where your deeper learning is going to happen. Spaced repetition is defined as a learning technique where you review information at increasing intervals of time to improve long-term retention. It's based on the idea that our brains learn most effectively when we revisit material after periods of forgetting. So what happens is you, like if you're cramming, you learn something, it creates that kind of weak neural pathway, and it'll fade pretty quickly if you don't work with that information or reuse it or in some way. And if you come back to that 2 days later, it'll be weaker. You may have forgotten some of it, but there's still that little bit of that neural pathway that survives, and you do that technique and you revisit it, it gets stronger again. And the more times you revisit it, the more permanent that becomes, and the quicker you can access that information when you're asked about it, and the more accurate you will be when you're answering questions after using these techniques. Um, Cramming is the technical term for cramming is called massed learning, where you do everything in a big mass. And I also call it boot camp learning because you're kind of like in a military thing where they just drill you and drill you and drill you and drill you, and you better remember it tomorrow or someone's going to yell at you. But no one's going to yell at you, but you know what I mean. So Can anyone think of one thing you need to do to be able to engage in spaced repetition?
Is it something you need to be able to do?
Yes.
Um, like be in a space where you can repeat it to yourself a bunch of times, like in
Yeah,
quiet
that's
space.
certainly true. Also, you need time.
Yeah, of
Can't
course.
engage in spaced repetition if it's noon today and your test is at 4 o'clock. You're just going to be engaging in cramming at that point. So you need to do some, um, someone drawing on the screen. If you need to do some, want to do some spaced repetition, you need to plan it out in advance, 2 weeks before the test, 3 weeks before the test, to start working on these things. And that way you'll have the time to do it. And if you use your time wisely, and I highly recommend that everybody, when you're in school, you keep a really good digital calendar of all of your classes, all of your big assignments when they're due, all of your tests when they're happening, and scheduling in study time. And try to hold yourself accountable to those schedules. And if you do that and you start to see, oh, I have a test on, September 15th. Okay, so it's September 15th. I probably want to set an alert like 2 weeks out to start studying for this test. So you put an alert on that event that your test is for 2 weeks out. And every time that alert goes off, set that alert for another day or two in the future. So it goes off again and it reminds you that this thing is coming. Even those little reminders start to stimulate little things in your brain about the topic that you're studying, which is helpful, not as helpful as actually cracking open the books and doing some studying, but continuing to do these repeated activities is how you build those strong neural pathways. And if you're in a situation where speed is of the essence, this is pretty much mandatory for being able to do that with any rapidity. If you don't have those strong neural pathways in your brain developed, then the speed of which you'll recall that stuff is going to be a lot slower. That's just how it works. And here is a little chart that kind of goes over the things, gives you the definitions of the two things. Um, Looking at goals, like I said, cramming. If your goal is not short-term memorization, then cramming is not the technique you should be using. If you're trying to remember something for the long term, then you want to use spaced repetition or some other study technique, which there's a couple others, but this is probably the best one you can use. And it's probably the one we use the least because we are all procrastinators. We put things off until the last minute. But if you can force yourself not to do that, and especially in your difficult classes, if you have an easy class and it's not in your major, you know, do what you need to do to get through those classes. But if it's in your major or something you really need to learn and remember because you're going to be asked about it later, then using one of these techniques is essential for that long-term retention. Also, I'm a big fan of low output, high reward activities where you get more bang for your buck than and your effort than you would otherwise. And cramming is probably the highest effort studying technique you can engage in. Not only is it time consuming, you're staying up all night, you're missing sleep, and blah, blah, blah. It's stressful. It produces anxiety. It makes you and can cause physical reactions, when you have all that adrenaline and stuff coursing through your bloodstream, you're on edge, your heart's racing, and it's not generally a healthy place for you to be. So the less stressful environment you can keep your studying in, the better off you are. Um, and yeah, the best to use for courses with cumulative exams or skill building classes. Yeah, and also classes that are in your major where one class builds off another. You need to start developing this long-term retention for all of these things. Plus, when you get a job in your field and you go out to practice, you want to remember that stuff for later because you'd like to be good at your job. Um, there's some tools you can use. Um, Flashcards are great ways to do that. There's some apps like Quizlet. I've not used Anki, um, but that's another one that you can use for spaced repetition. And you can set up review schedules for yourself. On this day, work on this, that kind of thing. And here's you're studying for a test. Here's some things that a sample schedule. You do a little bit every day, 15 or 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, work on it, put it away, come back to it the next day. And it's probably a good idea to write these things out for yourself when you have a big test. Write something out. Once it's on paper, it's a lot easier to remember that you're supposed to do these things, and it's a lot easier to get yourself to do them because, oh, yeah, it's on written down here. I have to do this today. Then I do this today. Um, like I said, the apps you can use, there's flashcards, either physical or digital flashcards. I know my stepdaughter Maggie is a big flashcard user. I'm horrible at creating flashcards. I don't mind using them, but finding and you can get something to create you digital flashcards on top of. We're going to talk about technology things on our last session. I'll show you how you can use AI in a way that helps your learning and not replaces your learning. There's also this thing called the Pomodoro technique. Has anyone ever heard of that? It's a funny name.
I haven't, no.
I haven't. Okay, so Pomodoro technique was developed by a guy back in the 80s, and the name Pomodoro, I believe, was the brand name of his kitchen timer. And he would set a kitchen timer for himself for 25 minutes, and he'd study for 25 minutes and force himself to do that for 25 minutes. The timer goes off, he gets a 5 minute break. After the 5 minute break, set the timer for 25 minutes again and back at it. That's the Pomodoro technique, and that's a really good one. That's not only gives you kind of not really the spaced repetition thing, but it keeps your brain focused a lot more effectively than if you just have open-ended studying and you just study till you're burned out is not necessarily a good method because what happens when you study till you're burned out, the whole burning out period, which probably takes 15 or 20 minutes, that's not useful studying. You're probably going to have to go back over everything you did in that point anyway. So setting those timers are a good idea. I have a thing in my office when I'm working, especially when I'm working on a computer project or media editing project. I don't go any more than 2 straight hours of staring at the screen before I get up and walk around and clear my head a bit. Sometimes I go for the mile walk up to the business college and back, and that takes about 20 minutes, and I'm back in my office and ready to go. I highly recommend doing those things. It helps prevent burnout. And once you get burned out studying, it's really hard to get back up on that horse. And so preventing burnout is really, really important. So you kind of understand the spaced repetition thing. If you have any questions about that, feel free to ask. Um, the next one we're going to talk about is self-quizzing versus rereading. By far, the most common study technique that everyone uses, me included, is rereading your notes or rereading the textbook or rereading the articles or whatever it is you're just rereading. How many people do that? Let's see a show of hands of how many people are rereaders of notes. Yeah, pretty much everyone. Would you be surprised to find out that rereading is probably the least effective study method that you can use? The reason why rereading is somewhat ineffective is because it's so passive that every time you read something, you're not getting the same cognitive benefits as you do from using other techniques because you're just doing the same thing over and over again. And when you're just repeating an identical activity, it does not build those strong neural pathways in your brain like it by using another strategy. And also, what it does is gives you the false sense of security that you've actually learned something when all you're doing is recognizing it. You're not remembering it or learning from it. So rereading is not necessarily an effective study technique. Um, Instead of just rereading your notes, write yourself little quizzes about your notes. This is another thing that AI can be really helpful for. Write yourself a quiz, and instead of just answering it from memory, go to your notes physically where that answer is, or the textbook where that answer is, and read that section. That way, you're looking for something, and in that quest for finding answers, it starts to build those neural pathways. And when you find the answer, the awesome thing that it does is it releases a little dopamine into your system, which feels good. And that's your little reward for completing a task. Any task you complete, that's usually the case, is that your body releases a little dopamine to say, well done, let's do this again. And the more you do these things, the more you appreciate that feeling that you get when you've accomplished something, which is that dopamine in your system that makes you feel good. Rereading does not do the same thing. You get, reading it the first time and learning something and accomplishing something, it gives you a little reward. Reading it the second time, you accomplish a little bit, but it gives you a lesser reward. So it doesn't release as much dopamine into your system because your body doesn't think that this is that big of a deal. And the more times you do it, the less you get. Self-quizzing is a more active process because you're having to ask yourself a question, think about that question, and go look for the answer. That active process stimulates your memory, it builds strong neural pathways, it does all the things you need to do to learn the actual material. Um, some of the examples of that are practice tests. If you have a textbook with practice tests, take those practice tests. Do not do them from memory. Do them from the book. Look up the answers every time when you're taking your practice test because that reinforces all that material. It puts everything in context of what the book was talking about. When you're finding that answers, all those things, all those benefits you'll get by looking up the answers and not just simply answering them from memory, even if you remember the answer. Another great thing you can do is teach others. Nothing helps you learn something better than having to teach it to somebody. If you have a sibling, you can teach the material to your sibling. You can even teach it to your cat. It's just the process of saying those words and thinking about how you would teach somebody how to do something will increase your ability to do it. And yeah, the illusion of competence I mentioned with rereading, you feel like you know it, but you're just recognizing it because you've seen it before. You don't really know it, and you won't know it again until you see it again. And that's not the same as remembering. Does that make sense? And self-quizzing works because it forces retrieval practice, which, like I said, it strengthens your memory. It also reveals what you don't know yet. If you're self-quizzing, think about the answer when you're asked the question, even though you're going to look it up. If you don't know it, obviously there's one you don't know, and you need to maybe when you look up the answer, read a little more thoroughly of the section in the textbook where it comes from, or the part of your notes where you're getting it, or wherever it is. Um, the more you do that self-quizzing, the more confidence you'll build up. And a student taking a test with self-efficacy is a whole lot more effective and successful than a student who takes the quiz or the test and they're nervous about whether or not they can do it. Even if they know the material, you'll trick yourself into not knowing it by, being nervous and tentative about what you're doing. And just like um, the spaced recall things, flashcards are great ways to do self-quizzing. There's Quizlet, which I'm sure a lot of you guys used in K-12, is an app that you can use to make quizzes on topics. Um, Cover, recall, compare, find the answer, cover up the answer, try to remember it, and then compare what you thought with what the answer was or what it says in the textbook, and teaching a friend or your cat or the wall, or just practice going over trying to teach that to somebody, and you will remember a whole lot more. Does everyone feel like they can use self-quizzing and spaced repetition when you're in school studying in the fall? Is that something you're going to do?
I would say definitely.
It's, I highly recommend it. I'd say it's really hard to break out of habits. And if you built up a habit of 12 years of public education of rereading your notes, it's hard to break out of that. But the more conscious you are about that, the more likely you are to make a change. And just, I recommend just trying it once. If you try it once and it works, that will have all those same effects. You'll get that dopamine release, like, wow, I did great on this test because I used a technique that my brain says is effective. And you do it again and do it again and do it again until there's some gray-haired dude hands you a piece of paper in 4 years and says you're a graduate of their university. Um, any questions about those two techniques and why the recommended techniques are more effective than either the one we usually use, which is identified as probably not as effective of a technique? And the final thing for today I will leave you with is that planning is key to making all this work. If you're not planning your work, then you are sorry, just noticed that there's some stuff in the chat. If you don't have a good plan and a good schedule to do these things, they don't happen. That's why you need to be on top of your time management and scheduling and keeping a calendar. And especially if you're a person who may tend to forget these little details, like my children, and it's hyper important that you engage in some sort of planning. Also, within each study tech session, you want to set an objective for yourself. Today, I'm going to work these math problems for 30 minutes. Then go work those math problems for 30 minutes and you've accomplished something. You get the dopamine release for accomplishing a task that you set out for yourself. You've engaged in a space repetition study technique that's going to be more effective, and you've got a plan to do it again. So keep on top of your time management and planning when you're doing these things is probably the most important thing you can do. Any questions?